Hi, Doug. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're here today.
Of course, thank you, thank you. I'm Doug Crandell. I work for the University of Georgia at a place called the Institute on Human Development and Disability. And I have a sister with disabilities that I'm an advocate for, and of course I'm an author. In my work in Georgia, I direct something called Advancing Employment. Every state has what we call a training and technical assistance center. So we help job seekers with disabilities, employers, family members, students who are leaving school, all to focus on increasing the employment rates of folks with disabilities in Georgia, which is near and dear to our hearts, and that's across all disabilities. Developmental disabilities, behavioral health disabilities, neurodivergent disabilities, anybody who has a barrier to employment, we assist.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
So part of what you're going to talk to us about today is your latest book, which is 22 cents an hour, Disability Rights and the Fight to End Subminimum Wages.
Yes.
So the title is certainly an attention getter for someone who is not familiar with your work. It sums up what the book's about, but I know there are a lot of people who don't know what subminimum wages means, has never heard of that phrase. And I hope you'll tell us a little bit about what subminimum wages is and how it is that you personally came to write this book.
Yeah. Well, it's a long story, which I will make brief.
Thank you.
But I think like any writer, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, there was a question I couldn't answer. And that seemed strange to me, having spent 32 years in this field. I've always worked, after I graduated college, in disability and employment supports. And that question was, why in 2022 is this still legal? So subminimum wages falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is a little ironic, not much fair about 22 cents an hour. And under that FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, it's known as 14C. It's just the section of the Fair Labor Standards Act that allows people with disabilities to be paid subminimum wages. In 1938, so we're talking 84 years of public policy in the United States, it was initially designed for folks, lots of veterans, returning home in a manufacturing economy, and it had some good intentions in 1938. But as the decades went on, particularly into the 50s, we started seeing all this exploitation, and that it wasn't good public policy. But by that time, we were so invested in it as a way of supporting workers with disabilities, largely workers with disabilities who have the labels of intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so I began trying to research, and I thought it's probably not good that I can't articulate why it's still legal. And what I found was pretty disturbing, and has led me to, I think, kind of have a second gust of wind in the advocacy for economic justice for those folks who have been forced to work for subminimum wages. The title 22 cents does come from the goodwill boycotts in 2011 and 2012 and the Freedom of Information request that showed Goodwill was paying some workers 22 cents an hour while some of their regional CEOs were making $200,000, $300,000 a year.
I remember that there was a lot of coverage of the Goodwill boycott, and I do remember hearing something about that, although not the details, and it was very illuminating to get those details from the book. But another thing that I learned, the many things that I learned when I read this book, was about the Olmstead decision, and how important that has been in this journey, and that the two original plaintiffs in that lawsuit were two Georgia women, Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson.
That's right.
And I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about Lois and Elaine and how it is that they came to bring this lawsuit and how it led to Olmstead, and eventually we'll talk about Olmstead and how important it was.
Yes, it's such a good question. I decided early on in writing the book that readers coming to this would not be people in the human services field, right? That it would be people who were unaware of some of the complexities. So that was a challenge in and of itself, to try to write it in a way that anybody could pick up, trying to forego jargon and all that kind of stuff. But the other thing I decided was it had to be embedded within disability rights. It couldn't be a standalone topic. And it isn't, right? And Olmstead is the is really something we should celebrate, and we do. But Olmstead originated right here in Georgia, but it is a Supreme Court decision that covers, of course, the United States. Lois Curtis is still alive and well. Unfortunately, Elaine Wilson passed in 2010. Both women had only been afforded institutional care. And they met a woman named Sue Jamison, an attorney with Atlanta Legal Aid. And the ADA, of course, had been passed by that time. So we're talking about 8 years or so, 7 or 8 years that ADA had been the law of the land. But in Title II, there's an integration mandate. And that integration mandate says, if you're receiving public services in a state in the United States, that must be done in the least restrictive environment. But that had not been challenged. And so these 3 wonderful Georgia women took it all the way to the Supreme Court. Lois had been in institutions. Elaine had had electric shock therapy. They had had all the horrible services that you can imagine. Out of an institution, homeless, back in an institution. And so that happened in our country around the same time that something is called a Medicaid waiver was becoming much more readily available. And all that is, it's called home and community-based services, is instead of Medicaid paying for someone to be in an institution, it's much cheaper, much better physical health, mental health to do that in the community. However, Georgia, at that time, the Department of Human Resources, which is now DBHDD, said, take it or leave it. You get Georgia Regional Hospital, the institution, Elaine and Lois, that's it. So it was not a unanimous decision. It's named Olmstead because the former mayor of Macon was Tommy Olmstead, and he was appointed by Governor Zell Miller to be over DHR, and he was the named person that they went after in the state of Georgia. And so it was not a unanimous decision, but the Supreme Court ruled that yes, Elaine and Lois and others similarly situated, which isn't easy to say, have the right under the ADA and the integration mandate to get their services in the community.
So when you say in the community and you use the word integrated,
yeah,
those two mean the same thing, right? The
yes.
Integrated services take someone out of being locked up in an institution and into a place where they can be among other people.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And what's interesting about that is that Olmstead then was used, that Supreme Court decision, in the 2 big subminimum wage lawsuits, Oregon and Rhode Island. I've worked on the Rhode Island lawsuit for about a decade, going and providing training and technical assistance. But both of those lawsuits would not have been possible around subminimum wages without these 3 women taking the ADA integration mandate all the way to the Supreme Court and getting that favorable ruling. And what it essentially says are 3 things. 1, that professionals agree that somebody should get their services in the community. I'm not crazy about that. The second one, that the person wants those services in the community. Never met anyone in 32 years who wants to be in an institution. And the final one is, as long as it doesn't impact other beneficiaries. In other words, for one person, if it costs $2 million to get their services in the community, you have to weigh that with the other people on the waiting list for those services. So it was a win. There is now something, you can easily Google it, that says I am Olmstead all over the country that shows that people are living in the community because these 3 women challenged that. And it's something to celebrate as Georgians. Very few Georgians know about it. And then when I teach and train, it's really important for people to understand why that's such a crucial piece related to subminimum wages. So, yeah.
I feel like I really want to see a movie about Lois and Elaine and Sue and that whole battle.
Because I totally agree.
Yeah,
totally agree.
It would be such an inspirational thing.
Yes. And, you know, I don't want to be a downer here. Lois won in 2007 the Harriet Tubman Award for Courage. She is an internationally respected folk artist, real folk art, real outsider art, beautiful pieces. You can Google and see prints and originals. Elaine Wilson really used her voice in advocating. One of the most touching parts for me in the research was when Elaine learns to use PowerPoint. This is someone who had been written off by our culture. and teaches people using PowerPoint. She wore these beautiful little pearls and liked to dress up. And so she did get to experience life outside of the walls of that institution. But imagine if we had had Lois and Elaine for their full lives. Imagine people who still today, even with Olmsted, are not afforded either living wages or institutional care. And so the fight isn't over. It's just another step in breaking that chain, right?
Which brings me to the next thing I wanted you to talk about is Olmsted was great, and Olmsted was monumental, and Olmsted broke down some barriers, but we still have a long way to go.
We do.
Can you talk about some of the challenges that we still face?
Yeah, and it's impossible to talk about that without kind of getting to a chapter in the book that is about Henry's turkey service in Iowa.
That was hard.
Yeah, it's a terrible story, and so many people in my field, I mean, I understand when people aren't in the field if they don't know it, but there are plenty of professionals in disability employment supports that don't know. And so in a nutshell, Henry's turkey service went on for 30 plus years. Men were human trafficked from Texas to Iowa to be paid $65 a month to live in a horrible bunkhouse and work slaughtering and inseminating turkeys. Horrible, dirty work. Alongside people who were making $10 and $11 an hour, they were getting $65 a month. When the men ran away because they hated the working conditions, they were tracked down, brought back, and some were chained to beds. Now, what's amazing about that is we sounded the alarm. A wonderful journalist from the Des Moines Times did a story in 1979, 2 days in a row, really saying there's something wrong here. We did not, as a culture, close it down until 30 years later in 2009, and that's because a sister of one of the men found him and said something isn't right. Now, why I bring that up related to Olmsted is because we have ADA, we have Olmsted, we have this horrible situation, and we decide as a country, well, this is enough. We got to stop this. And so a bill was introduced called the Fair Wages for Workers with Disabilities Act in 2011. Did not pass. It would have phased out subminimum wages. The only reason those men were there was because they could be paid subminimum wages to do that work, $65 a month for 40 hours, sometimes 50 hours of work a week.
So they still could be?
Yes. Only in 12 states is it illegal to do subminimum wages. There's a bill right now in Congress, H.R. 2373, which would phase out subminimum wages nationally. But the same lobbyists and trade groups, and this kind of gets back to your first question, I wanted to know why it was still legal, and I found out that the rise of these trade groups in human services, they couch everything in benevolence, right? And that we're doing this for the poor folks that have Down syndrome. They wouldn't have any place else to go. You're taking away their work. That's easy to pitch, right? Mm-hmm. But these are trade organizations that have very highly paid lobbyists. And they spent $1.3 million, one group, to keep Fair Wages for Workers with Disabilities Act from being passed. And if you would look at their website, you'd go, oh, they advocate for people with disabilities. So it's this intersection in the United States, our peculiar kind of capitalistic system. We have a very medical model of disability instead of a social model like the UK has. Mm. And so Olmsted, just like the ADA, was used in both Oregon's class action lawsuit and Rhode Island's. But if we don't step up and contact our representatives around H.R. 2373, it's easy to see that if it's phased out by 2030, we may have public policy related to disability and employment for another 90 years. That's what this has been, 1938 to 2022. It hasn't been changed. So if we don't do something and enact good public policy around these issues, then we're going to have that same unintended consequences, like all public policy has,
Well, that brings us around to what you started out talking about, advancing employment.
Yes.
And your many years of work in disability employment.
Yes.
Advocacy. So tell us about National Disability Employment Awareness Month.
Yes.
What is that? And it's also short, NDEAM for short.
Yes, NDEAM for short.
Tell us how people can get involved in that.
Yeah, it's a great initiative. It gives us an opportunity to pause, we do that in America, right? We like a month for everything.
Yes.
But you can use that to raise awareness. You can use it as an excuse to say, well, look, some people with specific disabilities are much more, have much higher rates of unemployment than others. Not just the general community, and we see that in intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it's an opportunity to celebrate. We're having a Carter Center event on October 27th where we'll look at what we've done for the month. And so we have proclamations that are signed by elected officials. We have a core group of about 15 state agencies working on something called State as Model Employer. And since we're in an election year, it's important to bring that up. To try to understand a candidate's position on state as model employer. And it's very simple. If the state can show that we're being inclusive in hiring through diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's the theme this year. Diversity, equity, inclusion, plus disability, which I think is brilliant. And we focus on employers who've done that. They've created inclusive workplaces for folks. But it's just an opportunity to bring awareness around why is this a problem. If we don't ban subminimum wages federally, and I hope we do that sooner here in Georgia, again, I said there are 12 states, we're sending a very mixed message to employers. We're saying these people should be over here, don't worry about them. Now, here's a great figure. In the United States, families with a household member with an intellectual or developmental disability represent $66 billion, that's with a B, in purchasing power. Companies understand that, right? And so back to your point around Olmstead, one of the things that has come out in the last decade is this ability to self-direct. And what that means is instead of someone's Medicaid funding going to a provider agency who may not have the best interest of that person, a family can self-direct. They can hire their own staff to be a job coach, to get supports on and off the job site. And we're going to see more of that. Olmstead set that in motion. And again, that would mirror more of what happens in the UK with this kind of social model. Kathy Snow is a great writer and thinker in disability policy, and she came up with this thing that I think is just brilliant, that disability is natural, right? It's part of the human experience. Mm-hmm. All of us will experience disability in our lifetimes. That's just part of aging as well. And so public policy has to reflect that. So in Georgia, we're not only having the Carter Center event, but we're going to be out all month highlighting employer stories. We've got somebody from Louisiana on one of our webinars who's been a real big proponent in that state around state as model employer. We have friends coming in from Wisconsin to kind of teach us a little more about how to engage employers in some unique ways. So we've got a lot of educational pieces, a lot of advocacy pieces for National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and we would love for you to go to advancingemployment.com and join us in the fight.
Okay, so that's great. Everybody should get involved in NDEAM and find out what they can do. Everybody should certainly read 22 cents an hour. Want to wrap up with giving you a chance to tell us anything else you want to about yourself, your books, and what the road ahead looks like.
Yes, sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, writing this book has recommitted me to this work, and I'm really grateful for that. Some of the stuff that I uncovered I probably should have known. But I think in our culture, we really want to believe that it's all benevolent. And Dr. Amos Wilson, I'm paraphrasing here, he's a great thinker, African-American thinker from Mississippi. He's no longer alive, but a beautiful thinker. And he said, if you want to understand any problem in the United States, look at who profits from it, not who suffers from it. And that's the case with subminimum wages. But let me say this, because it's an excellent point that you've brought up here. We will ban subminimum wages federally. It's going to happen through HR 2373. However, what will replace that? Mm-hmm. And that's where we have to be really active in advocating for inclusion in general workplaces. The time's now. It's 2022. Let's make it happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Doug,
thank you
for talking to us today.
Yeah.
And I hope we'll be seeing a lot more from you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it.